Enter your participant ID. Pound to continue. You can now hear you speak. Being recorded.
Assalamu alaikum wa Ramadan Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum wa Ramadan Mubarak. In the conjunction with the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life, our Untitled Chapter for Life, we are here today with a very special guest, one of my teachers, many years. So, one we call him, we'll call him the Imam, and he's been one that really introduced me to a very critical intellectual examination of the Quran from a standpoint of scholarship, and I credit him with that influence in my life, and it's given me a great deal of a very solid foundation as I pursue my studies in religion. And he's one who I credit as being one of my teachers and one who's helped me to understand the teachings of Imam Warith Deen Mohammed. So I'm going to, it's an honor to have you here, Imam Faheem.
My pleasure.
Johns Hopkins University Muslim Association President M.A.R.I.A.M Mohammed is going to introduce you, read your biography, and introduce your topic. And then, inshallah, after that, we'll get started.
Assalamu alaikum. So today we have with us Imam Faheem Shuaibe, and I hope I'm saying your name right, has been the resident Imam of Masjidul Waritheen in Oakland, California for 38 years. He has been married to Yolanda Mahasin Shuaibe for 48 years. They have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. Faheem is a lifelong student of Imam Warith Deen Mohammed, rahimahullah. He is the founder of M.A.R.I.A.M, Muslim American Research Institute Advocating Marriage, a Clear Understanding Institute, and the Sacred Life Project, a public language codification project focused on the language, logic, and legacy of Imam Warith Deen Mohammed, rahimahullah, along with other African American scholars. Imam Faheem Shuaibe has been inducted into the African American Intellectual Royal Family by the Institute for the Advanced Study of Black Family Life and Culture. Imam Shuaibe addresses diverse audiences across the country on a wide range of topics of religion, world politics, human relationships, and societal evolution. He is an Netreprenuer and hosts 6 weekly blog talk radio broadcasts, and under his Clear Understanding broadcast, Wealth Creation and Preservation, All Things Human, For Those Who Thirst, and Jumu'ah live from Masjidul Waritheen in Oakland, California, Universal Dimensions of Leadership, and the Qur'an Salat Institute. His lectures are also broadcasted 24/7 on aclearunderstanding.net and vimeo.com. His most recent publications are The Clear Path to Human Development and The Reality of Our Sacred Human Nature, Our Origins and Our Destiny, which premiered as the #1 new release in religious philosophy on Amazon. Imam Shuaibe is a frequent lecturer at Cal Berkeley's Holy Hill for the Graduate Theological Union, which trains doctoral and postdoctoral students of philosophy, theology, and interfaith, and American Baptist Seminary of the West. His lectures are a rich source of inspiration and information to students and adults alike across the country. Faheem consults and advises large and small companies and organizations, including the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, California, AT&T, Chiron Corporation of Emeryville, California, University of California, Yale University School of Law, Howard University, Fordham University, and many other universities. Faheem Shuaibe is a frequently requested panelist and presenter at major national conferences and conventions sponsored by nonprofit and philanthropic organizations. He works with religious organizations of all faiths. He's a former board member of ING, an international interfaith education organization. His comments on contemporary issues are often cited by the Muslim Journal, the Wall Street Journal, the Oakland Tribune, the USA Today, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Faheem was a major consultant to several recent award-winning PBS film projects on Islam in America. Mr. Shuaibe has been part of several distinguished delegations that have taken him around the globe on various educational, religious, interfaith, Sudan, Malaysia, Egypt, the British Isles, and the Caribbean. He has received honorary recognition through proclamations and the key to the city in several municipalities across the country, as well as a Phi Beta Sigma fraternity's Notable Citizen Award. Faheem is a founding member of an A-list of intellectuals, professionals, religious leaders, and career diplomats on the Abraham Family Reunion Project, a national interfaith project. So without further ado, here is...
Alhamdulillah, wa bismillahir rahmanir rahim, wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna sayyidina Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Dear beloved brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, wa Ramadan Mubarak. Alhamdulillah to Imam Tariq and the great assembly of people who have worked to put this together and have worked diligently for the past couple of weeks, for sure. Bringing on many of my peers and compadres, I'll say, and it's been a very special, great history, and to see our young people continuing the legacy that we have, and appreciation to the Johns Hopkins University and all those involved under its aegis. I've chosen to tonight address the subject of the Quran produces natural and scientific thinkers, or it promotes natural and scientific thinking. And in doing that, I've decided I'm going to read the paper so that I'll have a tendency in reading it to be less preachy and more teachy, let's say. But to begin, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. خلق الإنسان وعلامه البيان والشمس وقمره بحسبان صدق الله العظيم. Allah the Mighty has spoken the truth. An expression of this, which is 55, Surah 55, Surah Ar-Rahman, verses 1 through 5. The most gracious, it is He who has taught the Quran, and He has created man. He has taught him speech and intelligence. The sun and the moon follow courses exactly computed. And to go back on that translation of verse 3, expression of verse 3, it didn't say, and he created man. خلق الإنسان, it just says, created man. Al-insan, and that's very, very particular. The language that constructs al-insan is the language of Al-Quran. That is what makes al-insan. And so to encapsulate the idea of al-insan, one very important way of looking at al-insan is just make it a composite of two English words, inside man. And of course, it's not just limited to the gender male. Inside man, but if you make a composite out of it, then you get insan, because that is the real man / human being, al-insan, and it's al-insan in the highest respect. But we're striving to understand the real power and force and the nature of language and how language forms the human being. That's the substructure of what we're speaking to. So when we see doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc., they are all constructions of language. If you take away their vocabulary, they are no longer the named professional. They're no longer doctors, lawyers, or engineers because they no longer have the vocabulary. You take them before they acquired the vocabulary, before they acquired the language, then you also do not have the named professional. So the difference between the non-professional person before they acquire that title, that label, that skill set, and afterwards, if it is ever lost, then also you lose it. So the difference is the vocabulary. It's the language that makes that particular person, or whoever wears that label, wears that title. They were born from that language. Well, al-insan, similarly, is made from al-Quran. Al-insan is Adam. It is Adam. When we say Adam, we mean the original human creation. Imam Muhammad, rahimahullah, who's been mentioned, he said Human beings were on the earth a long time before Adam was on the earth. What he was telling us was that it is not until man becomes conscious of himself as a creation of God, with a mission under God, that the biological person actually becomes Adam. You can be biologically human, but Adam has not arrived because of the absence of the connection consciously of the person of himself to the acceptance of the reality of God, and also feeling the responsibility and obligation to serve that God that he's now conscious of. And the same holds true for every physical person today. Until a person achieves that insight, they are a creation of God with a mission under God. Until they come into that reality, they are not yet Adam in the fullest and truest sense. Let's speak of the role of classical Arabic and how the Arabs came into grammar. The distinction of the classical Quranic Arabic from all other human languages is that Allah used the Arab people as the soil out of which a special language was grown. He did it like a scientist, creating a special substance in his laboratory. We know that since 1877, scientists have relied on the petri dish to grow or culture cells in the laboratory for distinct purposes. Similarly, Allah grew the original Arabic language in the pre-Islamic Arabic culture. The original Arabic language was grown specifically to be the vessel of the last revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nevertheless, I hasten to add that this is not a feather in the cap of Arabs in general. In fact, because classical Quranic Arabic is not the language in use for social communications in Arab countries. Scholars of linguistics actually call classical or Quranic Arabic a dead language. Dead being that it is not the language of the marketplace. In the Arab world, dialects of Arabic are spoken, not Quranic Arabic, so Arabs in general can't truly lay claim to the Quranic Arabic language as their language. Their language is the one they use in their everyday communications, the lingua franca, as it is called, the language of the marketplace with each other. That is their language. So you go to any of those countries that would be identified as Arab countries, then their language is the language that they speak in the marketplace, in their common speech. Ibn al-Khaldun, some call him Ibn Khaldun, he said Quranic Arabic has a completeness that was nurtured into it by Allah. Then urbanization caused the language to decay. With it, the decline of civilization amongst the Arabs. Then the purity of the original language was restored by the revelation of the Qur'an and the lived example of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. As Aisha, radiallahu anha, she said, when asked, what is the life of the Prophet? She said, don't you read the Qur'an? He's the Qur'an walking. So the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was the Qur'an made flesh. One of the translation exercises from the Arabic learning text gives a brief summary of the language history of the Arabic language after Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The text translates as this: the classical Arabic language was the international language in the time of the Abbasids, and that time would be from the 8th to the 13th century. This was the period of Islamic civilization. It was the Arabic language of that civilization which translated the books from the Greek and the Persians, as well as thousands of manuscripts in medicine and engineering and mathematics and science and others like that. It was the Arabic language that took the sciences to Europe. Over time, the Arabs began to grow weak about their religion. Then the classical Arabic language left, and they tried to use their dialects. Then after colonialization came, war was made on the Islamic culture and on the classical Arabic language through the promotion of dialects. After that, there was the dialect of the Egyptians and of the Moroccans and of the Syrians and so forth and so on. This led to divisions among Arabs, each from the other. Every time an Arab traveled from his country to another Arab country, they couldn't make true connections because of their differences in dialect. And you can see a mirroring of this in the picture of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, when it says, let us confuse their language so that they won't be able to achieve what they are seeking to do. They was, according to the story, they were trying to build a tower so they can go up to God. So according to that story, the languages were confounded. There's a moral of that. The moral of that story is that where communication fails, no productive work is possible. Where communication fails, no productive work is possible. And so that can also be used as a strategy against, which is, as was pointed out by the colonizers. The colonizers used that very strategy by promoting dialects and making war on an Islamic culture, which would be undergirded fully by the Quranic language, as was the case in the golden era of al-Islam. So the idea is that the critical place and role that language plays in any civilization is what we today, and especially I'm saying, we need to recognize that we have to be much more emphatic about our embrace and our learning and our utilization of the original Quranic Arabic language. There's a childcraft book story. There's a set of children's books that I had back at the time that this was actually published in 1954. And from the time I read this story, I mean, I was born in 1951, so it was published in 54. But I was an early reader, but I wasn't reading this at 3 years old, I'm sure. However, the first time I read this story, it stayed with me, and of course, I can remember the little picture that actually went with this prose here, I'm going to call it. But the title of it is The Master of All Masters. And I'll just read it. Master of All Masters. Remember that title. It's very important. A girl once went to the fair to hire herself for a servant. At last, a funny old gentleman engaged her and took her home to his house. When she got there, he told her that he had something to teach her, for in his house, he had his own names for things. He said to her, "What will you call me?" She said, "Master or Mister or whatever you please, sir." He said, "You must call me Master of all masters. And what do you call this?" pointing to his bed. "Bed or couch or whatever you please, sir." "No, that is my barnacle." "And what do you call these?" said he, pointing to his pantaloons. "Breeches or trousers or whatever you please, sir." "You must call them squibs and crackers." "And what do you call her?" pointing to the cat. "Cat or kit or whatever you please, sir." "You must call her white-faced simony. And this now," showing the fire. "What would you call this?" "Fire or flame or whatever you please, sir." "You must call it hot cockalorum. And what is this?" he went on, pointing to the water. "Water or wet or whatever you please, sir." "No, Pondalorum is its name." "And what do you call this?" asked he, as he pointed to the house. "House or cottage or whatever you please, sir." "You must call it High Topper Mountain." That very night, the servant woke her master in a fright and said, "Master of all masters, get out of your barnacle and put on your squibs and crackers, for white-faced simony has got a spot of hot cockalorum on her tail, and unless you get some pondalorum, High Topper Mountain will all be on hot cockalorum." The message of this children's story is that what makes one a master is the mastery of language, and that the master of the house is whoever dictates the language. According to history, the Arabs were described by Alexander the Great, this is around about the 4th century BC, as beasts in human form. Alexander the Great is known for his exploits and conquering and the like, and so he was moving. When he got to the Arab Peninsula, as we call it now, he said that there's no victory in seeking to conquer these people. They've already defeated themselves. They are beasts in human form, according to the report. And this is the 4th century BC, right around 336 BC. Of course, now the revelation of the Qur'an comes in the early 7th century, 600. So there's like 1,000 years separated there. And then the stories that are told, especially the stories that one of the ways that you can get at where they were even, was that almost 1,000 years later or less, the way that it was described to the Najash when the bounty hunters or when those people that were coming to take them back after they had made hijrah to Abyssinia, the story was told about the kind of life that they lived and the kind of food that they ate and the kind of treatment that was had. They were very uncivilized by description, even in the 7th century. So imagine 1,000 years earlier, what lack of civilization was present among them at that time. This is simply history. According to the history, the Arabs were described by Alexander the Great as beasts in human form before the coming of the Qur'an. And then they became the saviors of civilization in less than 200 years, because we speak of the golden era that we just mentioned of the Abbasids from the 8th to the 13th century. So the Quran, as you know, comes in the 7th century, and then in the 8th century, they're already carrying the torchlight of civilization for the world. That's just simply magnificent. And that in itself is a miraculous transformation. And to what is that transformation indebted and owed? It is because of the Quran. So why did Allah create the classical Arabic language? This is a critical point to conceptualize that the language of the Quran, that Arabic language that is the language of the Quran, is a language that was very specifically created for the purpose of carrying the Quran. Why did Allah create the classical Arabic language? Dr. A.R. Fatihi, in his writing, The Communicative Dimensions of Quranic Translations, explains something very important that helps us to understand why Allah created a special language for his last revelation. The doctor says, normally one translates ideas on which words act as constraints. What this means for us, now I'm stepping away from the quote for a moment. What this means is that by analogy, words are like cans, and ideas, the meaning that they carry are like the content in those cans. So words are containers. So when he says that words act as constraints, it means that the words contain, it set boundaries around what they are intended to carry. Consequently, he says, it is useful as a warning against taking Quranic expressions at their face value and against translating from or into primary meanings of words. And again, I step out from the quote. This means that what he's pointing out is the fact that it is in the nature of the words which act as containers on ideas and principles and values and meanings. That's what they are, containers, right? And so they contain something that is itself abstract. And so he's warning against thinking that you can simply translate and interpret the primary meaning of a dictionary definition of a Quranic term and think that you have properly translated or properly interpreted the word. Because the word is just something that, I don't know, the image, I often just utilize images. It's like, okay, you go to the grocery store, they put the products that you purchase in the bag, whatever, paper or plastic, you put it in there. And so then you have a handle, you have a handle on the bag. And so now you can carry all of that material in the bag, right? But the real substance is not the bag. The substance is what's in the bag. Well, words carry meanings and values and principles which have brought, and when we speak about the Quran, it's far more, this is far more true about the Quran than it is about perhaps any other language, because these are carrying words or carrying meanings and ideas and principles and values from the Lord of the worlds. So the point is that to just use a dictionary definition, which has by and large, temporal utilization. One of the words historically, emulate. Emulate used to mean to oppose. The original meaning of emulate when it was first used, but now it means in the English language it means to whatever, copy. You see, I have to say emulate to reproduce in yourself what you see in the other. So the point is that the dictionary definitions of terms as are used in various cultures, they serve the purpose for the time, and much more to be said about that. So to carry on, his warning is, don't think that when you see the meaning in a dictionary of a Quranic term that you have gotten what it actually means, what it actually carries, because there's a transcendent meaning in those terms from the Lord of the worlds that you may miss. Amplifying this point, Imam Muhammad said, words contain concepts and concepts contain a logic. And it is not until you grasp the concept and the logic in the words that you can speak the language, which ultimately means you can apply it correctly in the world, right? And we have this formula that Allah reveals to us, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran. يَعْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. Kitab is the book. The hikmah is what is inside of it, what it is carrying. And what it is carrying, along with ideas, meaning, principles, values, are also concepts and logic in the words themselves. So you getting beyond the dictionary lookup meaning of the word, it's like, okay, but what is the concept? What is the logic inside it? What is the value? What is the principle in that? And it's the discovery of that familiarity with it, that the newborn Muslims out of the Arabs of the time of the 7th century, that it was that attitude and that take on the Quran that caused them to have a powerful impact on the world, one that has not been repeated since that time. But we are in alignment to be able to do the same if we will. So why did Allah create the original Arabic language? Because it was his plan to reveal ideas, meanings, principles, values, concepts, and logic hitherto unknown, not just to the Arabs, but for the benefit of mankind until the end of time. That is a critical thing to understand about the Quran too. The Quran, no matter where we go in the universe, no matter what mode of transportation, or whether we beam me up Scotty, or whether we are going through wormholes, or whether it doesn't matter, the Quran is going to have its value, power, worth, and utilization until the end of time, mashallah. So inside the Quran is what is necessary for all the worlds that will ever be produced to the end of time. So how rich must it be? So the Arabs, for the benefit of mankind until the end of time, he would reveal ideas, meanings, principles, values, concepts, and logic that would serve man until the end of human history. And as for those revelations that said he taught man what he was before not knowing, what he was not before knowing. And in the later revelation, Allah states that he is teaching you new knowledge. This is, so every time this is more than 1,440 so lunar years hence from the beginning of the revelation. And every time that statement is read, it's true. Every time that statement is read, it's true. Allah is teaching you new knowledge. When? In the 21st century. Okay, I'm reading it in the 41st century. If there is a 41st century, what will you read? He's teaching you new knowledge. Allahu Akbar. So all of this speaks to the intention of Allah and his plan to have language capable of containing divine ideas, divine meanings, divine principles, divine values, divine concepts, divine logic, divine wisdom. This is Allah made a language for that job. And we have it. And it is the commemoration of the month of Ramadan of receiving that revelation. We must also remember that just as the original Arabic language was prepared in anticipation of Allah's plan or in support of Allah's plan to reveal new knowledge, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, I know I spoke his name as one before he was the prophet, but alhamdulillah, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, before he knew it, he was also prepared to be the recipient, the carrier, and the exemplar of the last revelation. It was Allah's plan before even Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam made the dua asking Allah to send among them one who would purify them and teach them the book and the wisdom. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Muhammad ibn Abdullah would be the seal of the prophets and demonstrate how that last revelation was to be lived in the world. And God says to him very early in the process of revelation, soon we shall send down to you a weighty word. That's 73 verse 5. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used both the language that he developed in the Arabs and a special human being, special only in the sense that Allah wants to give us a perfect model of what he intends for human beings to be, that Muhammad, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that Muhammad is intended to be the model. Allah knows that he created us to be a people that grow upon the model imperative, and you can't be what you can't see. So Allah gave us a perfect model of this is who I created you to be. This is your potential. And he tells the Prophet to say to them, Ana basharun mithlukum, I am a flesh and blood human being just like you. Allah preserved him as the model so that he can be a witness to us, and so that we, in following his model, can be a witness to the nation. So Allah prepared him for that purpose. So when we say a special human being, we only mean that, not to say that he's superhuman, not human, or demigod, or anything like that. Is Allah prepared him for a particular mission. And he, in that nature, executed as Allah ordered for him to execute. And he stands continuously as a model for us today. So the grammatical logic of the original Arabic leads us into a universal logic, not the universal logic. The eloquence and poetry of the Arabs was legendary before the Quranic revelation. So the power of that, and I believe I've seen somewhere where that the word itself means eloquence. Arab means eloquence. That's not in my paper, so I don't have to be right on that, but seems somewhere I've seen that. The eloquence and the poetry of the Arabs was legendary before the Quranic revelation. Some scholars say that those people were actually called Arab. Oh, this is where I read it. Those people were actually called Arab because the term alludes to the beauty of their language. Even so, before the Quran, the Arabs themselves hadn't codified the grammar of their own native tongue. This is also a very critical point to understand. The absence of a codified grammar at the time of the coming of the revelation. Critical point. Hold on to that. That's very important. So even before the Quran, the Arabs themselves didn't have a codified grammar. Before Mount, speaking of myself, that learned earlier, it was always so they didn't even have a language. They would say that the Arabs didn't even have a language. And while that was true, we didn't understand, well, what does that mean? I mean, they were communicating with it, but they didn't have a language. What it meant is that they didn't have a codified grammar. Not having a codified grammar, then that means you really don't have a language. So they themselves hadn't codified the grammar of their own native tongue. This is because prior to the revelation of the Quran, the Arab intellect hadn't risen to the level of grammar. Remember, Alexander the Great, 4th century, Revelation comes in the 4th century BC, Revelation comes in the 7th century. The evolution, as far as they had advanced, it was described in the response to the Najash and they were still savage in that respect. But no, I'm sorry, savage is not really the best word. Jahil really literally is the word, and we have more to say with regard to that. This is because prior to the revelation of the Quran, the Arab intellect hadn't risen to the level of grammar, meaning formulating their own grammar. To better understand what that means, let's revisit Imam Muhammad in his statements regarding language. He said, in speaking of how language and civilization evolves in man, he said, man comes up with communication for him and his people in his family or in his environment, a common language, right? That's just the nature of man. He comes up with all these different lands where there are people, languages come up. What do the languages do? They serve the needs of the people who use that as communication. So it's a natural process evolving out of human existence. He further stated that just nature itself, not the brain so much, but nature itself played a great role in bringing people to form some kind of language. It's just automatic. Some kind of language for communicating between one another. Then the intellect comes on and takes over. When the intelligence takes over, then they start to refine that language, that common language that they have. Those, maybe there's some linguists in the audience. You have the esoteric and the exoteric language. The esoteric language, sometimes you only think about secrecy and the like, but esoteric language means it's a language that is really only shared by that small group of people, that tribe, etc. So it's esoteric because it's limited to that tribe, that group of people. Until it gets expanded in a way where it can be communicated to others, it will remain an esoteric language. But it has to, in order for it to become a broader and certainly a civilizing language, a language that can go outside the boundaries of those language speakers, it's only then that it can become exoteric. In order for it to become exoteric, then it has to have a grammar so that somebody can make sense out of it in terms of that. So the Arabs hadn't gotten to that place as of the time of the coming of the revelation. They hadn't gotten to the place where they're beautiful, though it were, they hadn't gotten to that place where the Arabic that they were speaking, which was the Arabic that Allah cultivated in the petri dish of the Arabian Peninsula. And so the richness of it was there, but it wasn't yet ordered. It was serving them, but it wasn't yet ordered. Alhamdulillah. And ultimately, that brought those people into a logic for their language that is called its grammar. So this happens. The Chinese come finally into grammar, and the Europeans come ultimately into grammar, and Africans and others come into grammar, the Greeks and the like, the French, German, etc. They went past the common esoteric role that language plays in the life of themselves as a people, as a tribe, or what have you. But then in order for them to expand and grow, civilizationally speaking, it has to come into a grammar. And that's where the intellects among their people, that's the role that they play. Well, in the case of the Arabs, as of the time of the Quranic revelation, the early 7th century, the intellect of the Arab had not yet taken over. So they had not yet formalized the language, they had not yet formalized a logic for their language. Indeed, the very time of the coming of the Quranic revelation was called Jahiliyyah, a time of ignorance. Yet and still, the term Jahiliyyah itself gives civilizational insight into the Arabs of that time. The term Jahiliyyah speaks to a natural kind of ignorance. It refers to the ignorance of a child. And that is why on the scale of civilization, before the Quran, the Arabs were considered to be a people without a language. There is an allusion to this understanding in the English word infant, which comes from the French word enfance, which means without speech. So until speech is stabilized in a child, that child is still an infant. But once speech is stabilized, they move from being an infant to being a child. So Allah, by His will, deliberately sent the Quranic revelation before the Arabs were at that natural stage of civilization where their own intelligence would take over and institute a different kind of grammar, thereby a different kind of logic for their language at the time, because He didn't want them to. He said, this is my business here. So now it's time for me to add that last element here. Remember, this is the work that was done not by and about and for the Arabs per se. It was Allah fulfilling His plan for man. Allah Himself had set the condition for His revelation, and that would bring the divine grammar, that would bring the divine logic. And Allah even told Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to not be hasty in reciting it and the like. 75:16 through 19 Quran, it says, move not your tongue concerning the Quran to make haste therewith. It is for us to collect it and to promulgate it. But when we have promulgated it, follow you its recital. Nay, more it is for us to explain it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, this is my book. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is my book, totally. Alhamdulillah. So Allah revealed the Quran in the original Arabic that He had cultured. And through and with the Quran, Allah revealed and codified the divine grammar of the original Arabic language. Referring back to Ibn Khaldun's reference, it said it was lost among them, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought it back through the Quran. Divine grammar for the original Arabic language. Consequently, it was the Holy Quran that made the Arab not only a people with a language, but a people who quickly became the leaders of civilization. So here's a simple reasoning to the point to be made for tonight. The phenomena of creation, the Quran calls them ayah, right? The verses of the Quran, they are also called ayah. The verses of the Quran are just like the phenomena in creation. Phenomena of creation are governed by laws, and the sun and the moon follow courses exactly computed. The phenomena of creation are governed by laws, the laws of physics. Verses of the Quran are governed by the laws of grammar. Scientific development comes from the study of the creation. And scientific development came from the studying of the Quran. Being in contact with the natural phenomena of creation makes human beings more natural and more scientific. Likewise, being in touch with the verses of the Quran makes the reader of its revealed language a more natural and scientific thinker as well. Francis Collins, who was the one who finished the Human Genome Project, it was started, it has its own history. He has a publication, probably many others, but the one I'm mentioning now is The Language of God. He has a book, Language of God, and part of that book is his explaining how he came into science. He was raised by I'm going to go ahead and call him a kind of hippie commune type family who were themselves atheists, but they lived in touch with and in tune with nature. And so all their education was learning from and through the media of nature. So he never went to public schools or anything like that, but when he ultimately did wind up maybe 14 years old, going to some public school, some form of education, I'm just going to say, the rest is history. He became a believer, a Christian believer, and he led and completed the Human Genome Project. All that from someone who was raised by atheists, and I guess I could say they were raised to be an atheist, but what happened? He was so in touch and so educated by nature that nature led him to believing in a creator, to believing in God. So you have the combination of both natural and scientific thinking just in them as an example, but you have the whole history of the Jahil Arabs as an example as to how they were raised up from a completely inhumane civilizational stance or position, where when the Quran comes in, the total transformation. It's literally bringing the human being back in touch with his original inside man. Al-insan, ar-Rahman, allama al-Qur'an, khalaq al-insan. So the same thing that nature does to a human being by the human being being in touch by it. Fitratullahi lati fatara an-nasa alayha. This is that statement of the Quran is telling that you and nature are one and the same, and it is natural for us to grasp and be in touch with and have an intuitive feel for the nature of creation and the scientific aspects there and our ability to grasp the concepts and ideas and the principles that are there and present. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. The Quran creates a mind that is more capable of doing that. My last few words would be these. Language is something that all human beings do. And one human language is not by nature necessarily better than another. Now we're talking human languages, okay? Language is a tool, and language, like any other tool, is value neutral. Meaning, for example, a shovel. A shovel is not innately or inherently superior or inferior or positive or negative or better or worse. It's simply a tool. Human language is a universal human ability like other human capacities, like walking or the activity of the senses or eating. The distinction, the merit, and the worth of any given human capacity is in how that capacity is put to use. What do they walk towards? How do they apply their senses? What do they eat, etc.? Relative to human language, the distinction, the merit, and the worth of any given language is in its potency of the vocabulary and the use to which the language is put. You know, the French and the Spanish and the German, all these languages have their stereotypical best place and best uses. I won't apply them, but the idea is that the French language and the Romance languages, etc., are said to be better for this. The Germanic language is better for that. The Greek and Latin is better for this because it has that particular quality that's best used. Just like a screwdriver is better for some jobs versus a hammer for others, or a saw for others. Same way with human languages. So relative to human languages, the distinction, the merit, and the worth of any given language is in the potency of the vocabulary and the use to which that language is put. So what is the potency of a vocabulary? What makes a vocabulary potent? Since it's the nature of words to act as containers for ideas, meanings, principles, and values, then the potency of a vocabulary is in the magnitude of the power and the generative force in the ideas, the meanings, the principles, and the values that those words contain. Know all the words. They contain concepts, and all concepts contain a logic, as the Imam said. So the potency of a vocabulary is in the magnitude of the power and the generative force of its conceptual logic. So you put all these things together, ideas, meaning, principles, values, concepts, logic, and compare which ones carry the most, which one are most potent in those respects. There's not a language on earth that is more potent than the words of Allah in the Quran. So Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, we thank you so much for your time and attention and patience. And I thank Allah for the honor of having shared this time with you. May the peace and blessings of Allah be on you. May Allah accept our fasts, and may Allah purify us in our intentions and guide us near to the path even in this. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm done.
SubhanAllah, I wanted you to keep going.
Well, that's all I wrote. So as they say in the language, that's all she wrote.
Well, alhamdulillah, that was very, very potent, very powerful, very appropriate for our student audience. I do know with some of the students observing the Night of Power tonight, we had some intermittent attendance, but this generation of students, they digest things on the internet and watch it over and over again, listen to it, and so I'm very, very interested to see what their response is to the insightful information that you've given. We do have a number of people here. We have some questions. I have now. Would you like to take those questions
Yes.
verbally or typed in the chat?
No, I mean, if you're going to monitor it or moderate it, then it's easier for me.
Okay. So we have a sister, Najima. You're unmuted.
She still appears to be muted on this one.
She's still seems to be muted. Let me see. You have to unmute yourself, Sister Najima. We can't hear you.
I didn't have a question. Sorry, it was an accident.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
She said she doesn't have a question. It was an accident.
Yes. So any questions anyone has, please come into the either type them in the question and answer box at the bottom. You could type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you.
It's okay if there's no questions.
Means you gave them a lot to think about.
Inshallah, that's the hope. Yes.
I really, being in this environment, being the assistant chaplain for Muslim life here at the university with undergraduate students for this year, the power of language is very evident in the education of the students. The language, you hear the language in the environment at the university, and you hear the language that the students use to communicate to each other. You hear the language that's used on that campus environment. And there is a certain mind being produced in the college environment. There's certain sensitivities being produced in the college environment. And they're not necessarily with respect for the things that you were addressing in terms of the Quran. They have a specific focus, whether that's to achieve a certain profession, professional achievement, or scholarship in a particular field, to learn how to interact with all walks of life in terms of in academia, to deal with the powers that be in academia. But this is something, so that logic is still being used in that environment. That language is producing. You'll see a freshman come in with a certain level of language. A graduating senior has a different level of language.
Yes.
A different level of communication. So I thought that was very, very powerful, very appropriate for this audience.
A part of my pleasure in the subject is the fact that a person can actually create the path to where they want to go by being clear on which language is on that path. I mean, literally, it's like, where do you want to go? Okay, I want to go here. Okay, well, what's the language path to that? What kind of language is the language that you have to utilize? It's so much. It's very important. There's one that describes language. Speaking of the power of language, says that when someone uses a certain language, they draw a magic circle around themselves, a circle out of which they cannot be removed except by another language. And so it's like your language circumscribes your existence. So if you got a bad language or a limiting language or a language that really doesn't go anywhere, then you're locked into that. You have to get another language in order to move to another level. It's literal. And part of the problem in appreciating that for some is that language is so common to us. We just, okay, hey, we're just talking here. Yeah. No, you're not just talking, because when you talk, you raise up narratives and paradigms and mental patterns and all those things in the words that you speak. So it's a very, very critical skill, something to be very conscious of.
Yes, that's the power of language from our community. I just remember the man means mind, woman means woman mind. The words make people. The language of our community.
Yes.
We definitely look deeper into the words, and you being one of my teachers, one of my favorite teachers, very inspirational. I have learned to examine language very much from your teaching. Alhamdulillah. We have a comment here that says, thank you so much for your development of language and the Quran, very powerful and enlightening, from Deborah Najila.
I think I know her. Yeah, I think I know her. Ramadan Mubarak, Mom. Doctor.
All right, we have just a few more moments. Again, I don't think you all have broken fast yet, but it might be quick or soon. So let's see, we have questions. Let's see what this says. Okay. What are your thoughts on the same people, Muslims, who sparked the scientific renaissance in Europe, has fallen so far behind the world that Muslims only have, unfortunately, 3 scientific Nobel Peace Prize recipients?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I'll have to admit this. I cut out a portion of my presentation now with this question this time. But I'll make a reference to Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. I don't even know if he's living or not. He's still director of the National Islamic University of Asia. However, his book towards the internet, his doctoral thesis was published as towards an Islamic theory of international relationships. In that, and he broke down the history of Islam in such a way as said there was a time when we were all together. Then after, of course, the fitna that came in shortly after the Prophet's passing, particularly after the death of Akbar, then of course you got after that, you got the assassination of and then there was a split, and this split began at the time.
There's a sound issue on your the sound kind of went out a little bit on your.
Okay. I don't know. How's it sound right now?
You just sound a bit muted than before. I'm not sure what. You just sound a little muffled.
Yeah, I didn't change anything. I don't know what to do. I've got the volume all the way up, so maybe I'll try not to move so much, maybe. But shorter version then of what he pointed out.
You sound much clearer now.
Okay, it's because I'm being still. Is that he said that the Islamic community basically bifurcated into the political and the theological. That's why in many of these Islamic nations or Arab countries particularly, but Islamic nations, you have the theological leadership and you have the military leadership. That's sort of an inheritance from that time, which began with the assassination of Uthman, because a lot of fitna came after the assassination of Uthman, and then what are we going to do? What should we do? Blah, blah, blah. So the point is that there was a division, and so Shura was basically lost by and large, and that breach has not been mended so much. But going specifically to our not so high placement in categories as such, it has to do with what Dr. Abu Sulaiman said in his dissertation to explain that what happened was that the religious people got more involved in the lexical sciences, in preserving the rituals and those kinds of things, as opposed to dealing with the new knowledge and the new sciences that were actually evolving that we saw in the Renaissance, for example, even though we were the primary forces that generated it and that initiated it. But again, as centuries went on, Muslims got out of touch with the flow and the growth of knowledge. And I do have to say, the misunderstanding and the misutilization, the misapplication and the mistranslation, as we talked about earlier about dictionaries and what's wrong with depending exclusively on dictionaries, as Dr. Fatih said, is that term bid'ah, that term bid'ah got conflated in the wrong way with innovation. And so every bid'ah leads to hell or what have you. And if you only translate that, remember the original Arabic had been lost, and so now people are speaking in dialects. And so now when they hear the term bid'ah in that environment, mistranslating it as anything innovative is bid'ah, right? And so we stopped innovating. I read a book, this book called The Lever of Riches, and it talks about the history of invention and development and the like. And when it talked about the contributions that the Muslims made, it quote unquote gave them the proper compliments and laudatory assessment. They said, but for some reason around the 13th century, this is what the author is saying, but for some reason around the 13th century, the Muslims stopped innovating. And the author is saying that he didn't understand why. Now, Dr. Suleiman, in his speaking about that very condition, he's saying it's because that the leadership of the Muslim world at that time, they failed to recognize the new knowledge and the new principles harnessed to the values, ideals, and the goals of al-Islam. We failed to learn how to adapt without fearing adoption. Right? We stopped innovating because we conflated the innovation in material things with innovation in ibadi things, in things of worship. And so all of the apparatus for creating these new devices, new inventions, thinking created, they got lost. And so that's a part of the answer to that situation. And we Muslims have to be careful that in the aspiration to get back to the glory days, that you don't make the mistake of thinking more externally than internally, more ritualistically as opposed to the balanced, rational way that the religion comes. Ummatun wasata, the balanced way that we have, which has to have both sides of the picture. So it has much to do with the distorted ideas that came into the vocabulary, particularly when it comes to innovation or using knowledge that you can't find explicitly in the Quran, and the loss of ability to be able to see knowledge outside of the Quran, when in fact the entire universe is a classroom for us. But if you don't know how to read the creation with respect for the nature of your own creation and the creator himself, then yes, you will fall behind in the competition for innovation and novelty and creation and the like.
That's a powerful answer. We have one more question here, but I think about that all the time. I'm actually in the innovation business. I work with patents. I work in patent law, done it for the last 14 years. And to hear that idea that, in America, in most countries, the innovation office or the patent office that deals with intellectual property is in the Department of Commerce, or dealing with the economy and moving things forward and opening up new pathways for life to innovate and make things easier for society. And to have you cut that logic off, you no longer innovate. You lose your economy.
Absolutely.
You lose your thinking.
So who is it that would do something like that to us but Shaitan? That's Shaitan. When Shaitan cuts you off from that, he convinced you to think in a way that caused you not to do what Allah would have you do. Then he's got you. I don't have to worry about you anymore. But he came through the avenue of religion. He's, and then distorted that, and the rest is history.
So we have one last question. I want to respect your time, Imam Faheem. I know this is. Can we take one more question?
Sure.
Okay, this question is from Bayar. It says that, how do we as Muslims learn to translate or interpret different languages that we are bombarded with by news and social media? How do we as Muslims learn to translate and interpret different languages that we are bombarded with by news and social media?
Now, when they say different languages, they different languages inside of the English language. It's like what, conservative language, Republican language, Democratic language, what? I'm trying to understand. If you're talking about French, Spanish, German, or something like that, I don't really have an answer. But the idea is that we say, how do you interpret different languages? Let me give an answer. I don't know that it's going to be there, but if there's a clarification coming, then you feed it to me. One of the verses we've been working with recently, 256, where it says, "La ikraha fi din, qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy." Sadaqallahu al-azim. And bayan inside of that. In fact, did you say the person who asked the question's name was Bayan?
I did.
Okay, well then it's providential then, because they are the answer. They are the answer. You have to go after the truth. You and how do you go after the truth? This qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy. Bayan means you make distinction. You have to take what's being said, if it's important to you, if it's significant for you, to say, well, this person's saying something I don't think is good. This person's saying something I think is hurtful. This person's saying I think it's really good, or what have you. But I want to put it into the language of people who need to get it, or the people who need to be protected from it. Well, one of the things you have to do, bayan, you have to separate. You have to find the ideas. Let me give a simple way. One of the simple ways, if you're talking about every language is actually saying, whether you know it or not, every language I'm speaking right now, every speech, every time somebody is saying something, it's inviting a certain kind of behavior. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's speaking. Hip hop language is inviting a certain behavior. Islamic language, a certain behavior. Christian language, a certain behavior. What have you. Republican, Democrat, certain behavior. Okay. So this language is trying to get you to be a certain way. So you have to ask yourself, in whatever somebody says, it said, well, is what they are inviting me to be? If I were to act in the way that they are saying and the way that their words seem to be inviting to influence me in certain direction, so well, is that a good direction to go in, right? So then you ask yourself about what behavior is the language inviting, and even if they're speaking to somebody else, you're listening to them speak to somebody else, and you hear them giving them a language that's inviting them to be a certain way. You say, well, no, I don't think that's a way to be. Okay, so how do you deal with it? Just ever so briefly, I'll put it like this: you have to be able to find the logic that drives that person's that is driving that speech, right? Here's a trinity: language, logic, sensitivity. Language, logic, okay. Everybody who speaks in that speech, whether they know it or not, there's a logic to that speech. What is that logic? The logic is the behavioral expectation, which is sort of what I've just said, meaning that you're speaking in a certain way to a certain group, you're inviting them to behave in a certain way. Well, that's the logic in what your speech is. Now, I have to look at the logic. The behavioral expectation or the behavioral invitation of your speech, and say, is that something that we or they should do, right? And once you decide that no, that's not something that should be done, okay, well then you have to go in order to address it. You have to address the logic of the speech. And here's one of the ways to do it is you ask yourself, find out what their conclusion is. I'm literally go to the end. Okay, they're saying, therefore we should. Okay, therefore we shouldn't. Okay, that's their conclusion. All right. So then you say, okay, they said that's their conclusion. I know what your conclusion is, and here's how the logic works. It is this because of that. So this represents their conclusion. So it's like, so we conclude you should do this. You know, I'm not going to get into the hot controversy right now, but I could use one example right now that would go right to it, but I don't want to even invite that conversation right now. The point is that find their conclusion, that's their this. Because what you want to decompose, deconstruct, and get the bayan for is answer this. It's this because of that. So once I know you're this because of that, then I can argue about what you're saying. So if I get your this, which is your conclusion, now I got to go back and look back, where is your that? What do you mean, where's my that? It means, okay, you say I should do this. I want to know for what reason, right? So you can ask him and then, or her, you can find out from that. But if you're looking at a writing, for example, find what their conclusion is and then read back through it to see where, okay, they say this because of that. Now you look at their reason, they're that, and then you say, okay, is that the only conclusion that can be drawn from that reason? Or is that a valid reason for that particular conclusion? You have to question their that. You have to question their that. So I know what your this is. Now I find what your that is. And now I'm going to ask you about your that. And say, and if that runs counter to what I've embraced as what is being true, right, etc., well, then I stand against your conclusion because of the fact that the reasoning for the conclusion is not acceptable in my world or what have you. So the short version is we have to think. You have to think. You have to use your brain, and you have to deconstruct, decompose whatever the argument is, starting with what their conclusions are, and then find out what are the foundations for their conclusion and see what the strength of the veracity and the validity of their reasons. And then once you do that, then you have to come to your heart satisfaction and say, okay, they say this and they say it for that reason. I reject their reasons. And so either I'll come out against it the way as I should, according to what's dictated by my faith and my practice, or I say, mashallah, lakum deenukum waliya deen.
So alhamdulillah, that was a perfect question. I think you even touched on this a little bit. This person, and this is we're closing questions at this time. This person typed, when reading the Quran and Allah asks us a question, is that the beginning of scientific thinking, or does it further the ability for us to think scientifically?
It's beautiful. We have to have another session. Let me just make a suggestion. Suggestion is the Quran. The Quran is like rain. Let's work with that. The Quran is like rain, right? So it rains on the brain. I think there's a reason that brain is spelled with rain, because it's rain on your brain that causes your brain to grow. So the Quran, when it rains on your brain, then your brain grows, and it grows in the capacity to be able to think. Dhakir inna fa'ati dhikra. The Quran says, surely think, for surely you progress by the power of thinking. So God wants us to use our brain, but the Quran is just watering the brain. It's just softening up the soil. It's just wetting the soil of the brain, and then the brain grows. And so these properties of the brain, and that is what the book is about. No shameless plugs here. I'm just saying the book, The Clear Path to Human Development, it's about exactly that. It's about exactly that. From the verses 23:12 through 14, and it elaborates on that and the scales of the planes of the prophets in the Isra wa M.A.R.I.A.M, correlated with the cognitive developments of the human being, from the 5 senses all the way up to the highest levels of reasoning. And it's all there. It's already there, and it's there in the Quran. Allahu A'lam. But that's the path that we are to be on, because that's what we need in order to deal with the nature of problems in the world. Surah 10, Ayah 100. None can believe except by the will of Allah, and He will send uncleanness on those who fail to use their brains. So we have to. I mean, you really can't fulfill in the best way, in the leadership civilizational way. You cannot fulfill the mission of God on earth without the intellect and the heart's purification and the service of them together in accordance with the will of God. You can't do it. So, but don't just get focused on the heart, when in fact Allah says He has not created anything more excellent in its utility than the brain, than the intellect. So they both have to work together.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Imam Faheem, I said thank you. I want to thank you on behalf of the Johns Hopkins University Muslim Association for your time, for sharing. We have another comment here. Says that is a phenomenal explanation, Imam. It's amazing how all of this is connected to our development and our human foundation. I love learning and growing from these different perspectives Allah has given us in our uniqueness, Shukran, Imam Tariq and Imam Faheem. That's from another Najil, another my brother. My family is all here.
Yeah, I got all my nephews on the line tonight. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah. All right, beautiful. Appreciate it. I thank you, and I thank Allah for the family that you are and all the great things that are growing from you and your work, and John Hopkins and the Interfaith team and the like. May Allah continue to bless us to grow.
I mean, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming again. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Mubarak. I think tomorrow
Ramadan Mubarak.
Another California semi-California product, Shahida Sharif will be on tomorrow.
Allahu Akbar. Okay, wonderful. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.